Hello InfoPerson, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some really intriguing discoveries in regards to our eyes. Something that technically we do take for granted, but something that actually represents one of the most distinctive and one of the most complex organs in the entire animal kingdom. But also something that's extremely successful in terms of evolution, because a lot of different animals seem to possess eyes, and quite a lot of them use it for survival. And so in this video we're going to discuss this recent study that actually discovered something we've never known before, and specifically answers the question of why human eyes, or technically mammalian eyes, are so different from everyone else. But first, let's start with the somewhat unusual evolutionary argument that even Darwin could not answer. And that's because for centuries, the idea of eyes was even used as an argument against evolution. Mostly because it just seemed to be too perfect to have happened by chance. And even Charles Darwin famously admitted that the idea of eye evolving naturally, or through natural selection, seemed kind of absurd and was very difficult to explain. However, in the last few decades, a lot of studies, including some of the major papers from the last few years, have finally pieced together the incredible journey of how pretty much most animals got their eyes. And it turns out that in terms of evolution, back in the days, our ancestors basically used to be a kind of a cyclops, or they essentially possessed just one eye in the middle. And that turns out to be extremely important in explaining why human eyes, or once again mammalian eyes, are just a little bit different from many other kingdoms. And so today we're going to take a look at this recent study and discuss some of the main discoveries in regards to the evolution of vision, but much more importantly, we're going to discuss the fact that, turns out, we do have a third eye inside of us. Not some kind of a metaphysical or symbolic eye, but instead a real one that technically still has the same function as it did 600 million years ago. And ironically, it's literally right here, right in the middle. And so let's discuss exactly what scientists recently discovered, and well, in some sense, this might unofficially blow your minds and stuff. At least it blew my mind when I read it. But in a nutshell, this entire study explains the unusual properties of human eyes as a result of a temporary lifestyle change of an ancient mammalian ancestor 600 million years ago. But to understand the recent breakthroughs, we first have to discuss what scientists have already known for quite a long time. Or basically, we have to discuss the evolution of eyes in general and how we think all of this started. And as you probably know, the evolution of the eye is not a single event. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of evidence that complex eyes and the idea of vision very likely evolved completely independently at least 40, but possibly up to 65 times across different animal groups. In other words, this was such a successful mechanism that it basically evolved in completely different animals, resulting in completely different eyes. But despite this diversity, almost all eyes share the same basic genetic master control. This is actually a gene referred to as PAX6, a master regulator for eye and brain development. And in case you're wondering, it looks kind of like this. And so this is something that pretty much all organisms that contain eyes seem to have as well, suggesting that this is something that's extremely ancient and something that very likely evolved nearly 1 billion years ago. And for pretty much all organisms that evolved vision, it very likely all started in an extremely similar way. It started with simple light-sensitive proteins referred to as opsins. And this basically was a kind of an eye spot that could not actually see shapes and could not detect motion, but could tell difference between light and dark. This is actually something that still exists in animals like planarians. And so pretty much most animals that have eyes very likely began as this. But then eventually, a lot of these flat patches of cells started to fall inwards and started to form a kind of a cup. And this was a massive upgrade because now it allowed animals to tell which direction light was coming from. So essentially it allowed for limited directional sensitivity. Once again, this is something that does exist in some of the more primitive worms. But it's really the next step that started to change everything. Here we had the pinhole eye. And so as this cup got deeper and deeper, the opening started to get smaller, and basically it started to act like a kind of a pinhole camera, which allowed for the first actual images to start forming, even though overall they were quite dim. But as this cavity then started to fill with liquids, this is when things started to evolve very quickly, and the vision became better and better. And so basically the last step was the lens, some kind of a transparent protective layer most likely involving some kind of a transparent skin that eventually evolved into a lens that started to focus light. And though by itself this might seem like some kind of a very long process, according to various evolutionary models and computer simulations, in order to evolve from a simple eye patch to a much more complex eye with a lens, animals would not actually need more than 400,000 years. So in theory, this can be an extremely quick process and seems to be so effective that it happened dozens of times and resulted in very similar eye structures. And so that's the general path for most animals that resulted in a variety of different eyes. And by the way, if you actually want to learn about the unusual eye shapes and some of the unusual eye properties animals contain, check out one of the previous videos here in the description. But there's always been this one question in regards to the eyes that we have. Because compared to a lot of other animals, our eyes are actually a little bit different. And one of the best comparisons here is basically between our eyes and the eyes of an octopus. Or technically not just an octopus, but basically any invertebrate with complex eyes, including cuttlefish and squid. And this is of course a classic example of convergent evolution. Both the eyes of a human and an octopus evolved a kind of a camera-type structure involving a lens, an iris, and a retina. But the internal wiring seems to be entirely different. Specifically because in humans and a lot of mammals, the eye is actually inverted, whereas octopuses have everted retina. Or just to rephrase this, in our eyes, the sensitive receptors that perceive the light seem to be located in the back of the eye, with the neurons connected to all of this being in front, whereas for the octopus, the cells are in front and the neurons are in the back. And because of this, human eye has what's known as a blind spot, where a lot of these neurons, or a lot of these nerve fibers, converge at a single point and form what's known as the optic nerve. And so because there's a kind of a hole inside the retina, this forms a blind spot. Octopuses and squid don't have any blind spots. Our eyes also differ in the way they seem to focus and use the lens. The human eye uses tiny muscles, referred to as ciliary muscles, to change the actual shape of the lens, whereas octopuses seem to focus very similar to a traditional camera lens and move the entire lens forward or backwards. And so in other words, even though the overall effect of vision seems to be the same, the structure is entirely different. And of course, on top of this, humans have a sophisticated system, usually involving at least 3 types of cone cells that allow us to see 3 different colors, whereas octopuses just have 1 photoreceptor. But they're sensitive to polarization of light, which we cannot see. And so here the obvious question was, okay, so why did our eyes evolve so differently? And why do vertebrate retina seem to have such a strange structure compared to everyone else? And well, that's basically the focus of this recent study on the evolution of vertebrate retina that explains most of this by looking back approximately 600 million years. Now, first in the study there's this incredible illustration that summarizes the main differences and main similarities between various eyes in various types of animals. So everything from insects to different types of worms to, of course, vertebrates. But turns out that our eyes, or vertebrate eyes, may have had a much stranger history. And so here scientists George Kafetzis and Dan Nilsson surveyed 36 major groups of living animals and discovered that the light-sensing cells seem to be always found in 2 places, either paired on the side of the head, kind of like I guess what we have, or sometimes in the middle of the head, so basically a kind of a middle eye. And well, apparently 600 million years ago, we kind of had this unusual worm-like ancestor that seems to have had both sets. In other words, it had the lateral eyes and the middle eye. It's obviously not entirely clear why this evolved, but it very likely served some kind of a purpose. But around this time, very likely because of various climatic changes, instead of being active feeders and very likely moving around, they eventually became stationary and just like so many other worms became filter feeders, basically burrowed into seabeds and remained more or less motionless. And because they were no longer moving around, the eyes on the side of their head, or the steering eyes, were no longer necessary. And just like it usually happens with animals that don't use something, they eventually lose it. This actually happens to a lot of different fish that, for example, live in complete darkness and eventually lose their eyes. But because of their lifestyle, they very likely still had to be able to tell time, or specifically tell when it was daytime. And so they needed to have some kind of a simple way of detecting light. And so their light-sensing cells in the middle of the head seem to have remained, and eventually developed into some kind of a single midline eye that you can kind of see right here. And so as I mentioned in the beginning, 600 million years ago, our ancestors were possibly a cyclops, a tiny, motionless, warm cyclops. But then climate changed again, and our ancestors decided to change their lifestyle once again. And so they very likely returned to swimming, which means that they needed to steer again, and which means that they needed to have these lateral eyes that were so successful before. And the evolution solved this by having that single midline eye grow cups on each side, with these cups eventually moving to the sides of the head and becoming the pairs of eyes that most vertebrates have today. So basically this was the beginning of some of the first fish, with that fish eventually making their way to the terrestrial surface and evolving into lizards, which then evolved into mammals and eventually us. And overall this kind of explains why the vertebrate eyes are so different from invertebrate eyes, once again including octopus and most of the insects. And so our eyes are essentially a repurposed version of that central midline eye. Okay, cool, that's I guess an interesting proposition and an interesting hypothesis. But first of all, is there any proof? And second of all, why did I actually mention in the beginning that we still seem to possess a third eye? Well, that's because this particular discovery actually explains so much about one specific gland right here in the middle, the pineal gland. It's actually this super tiny red spot you see right there in the middle. And based on a lot of neuroscience studies, we know that in humans, the pineal gland, or this unusual pine cone-shaped structure, seems to produce melatonin and regulate our sleep. In other words, it's critical in regulating biological rhythms. But we also know that it's somewhat sensitive to light, as in it usually receives signals from our two eyes right here via hypothalamus. And so when it's dark, melatonin production increases, which makes you sleepy, but when it's light, the production is stopped, and this allows you to stay alert. And that's of course the natural of the so-called circadian rhythm. But we know that obviously other vertebrates have this as well. And intriguingly, in many other vertebrates like certain lizards, frogs, and of course fish, the pineal gland is actually connected to a visible third eye on top of their head. This is known as the parietal eye. Here's for example one in a bullfrog, and here's one inside the lizard. And this is not just a dot, this is an actual eye with a cornea, a lens, and a retina. And even though our pineal gland is technically buried inside the skull and does not see the light directly, it still contains exactly the same structure and same cells referred to as pinealocytes. These are actually found in the retinas of our eyes as well. Or just to rephrase this, if you were to shine the light on the pineal gland somehow, you would probably sense it. And so, in a very real sense, it's actually not wrong to say that we have three eyes, and we do have a third eye right here in the middle. Although we don't really see much with it anymore, unlike these other vertebrates like frogs and fish. But more importantly, this confirms this unusual origin story, and confirms that the origin of vertebrate vision is still inside of us even today. As a matter of fact, it confirms that our eyes very likely started from that central eye in the middle, sometimes 600 million years ago. But in terms of the evolution of vision, one question still remains. Why do so many animals contain eyes? Or basically, why is vision so successful? And today it's believed that it was really because of the Cambrian explosion approximately 540 million years ago. This is based on the idea known as the light switch hypothesis that suggests that once some of the first complex eyes appeared, specifically in animals like trilobites, it basically sparked a kind of an evolutionary arms race. And this is because vision turned animals into active hunters and not just passive feeders. And that means that prey also had to evolve in order to survive. And so here we had a kind of a burst of evolutionary innovation that eventually led to massive diversity of life and massive diversity of eyes we see today. But without this first evolution of eyes, the complexity we see inside of us would never exist. So the eye evolution was actually extremely important. But once again, because of the way our eyes evolved, and because they were kind of a split off from the central eye, they essentially contain a kind of an evolutionary baggage. So basically it explains why our eyes seem to be built backwards and upside down compared to eyes of octopuses. But despite this backward design, our eyes seem to be still much more efficient and even seem to have much higher metabolism, which actually helps us see incredible detail that's almost impossible for many different invertebrates. In other words, despite this backward design, our eyes are still much more efficient. But overall, these types of studies take us just a little bit closer to helping us understand how complex life evolved and how our brains and our senses seem to be wired together. And so this basically shows us that evolution doesn't always find a perfect path, but sometimes just takes these unusual shortcuts, or even repurposes something that we already have, in order to create something unusual and something spectacular. But at least for now, that's all I wanted to mention. Once we discover something else, we'll come back and talk more about this in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.